Jedburgh teams exploited that disproportion. They helped resistance units focus on rail disruptions that forced German movement onto roads that were visible to air power and easier to ambush. They encouraged attacks on communications infrastructure that slowed German coordination and made local commanders more cautious. They coordinated supply drops that transformed small groups from lightly armed patriots into fighters capable of sustained action. And they fed intelligence back to Allied headquarters, turning local observation into operational awareness. This is where the three-person team concept becomes easier to understand. A Jedburgh team didn't need to be large because it wasn't the mass. The mass was local. The team was the link, the radio, the planning discipline, the ability to translate a fast-changing front into actionable priorities behind the lines. And that's the real story device. Jedburgh isn't a raid. It's a network that learns in real time. But learning in real time has a cost. As resistance action increases, German security forces become more aggressive. They impose curfews, run sweeps, pressure villages, and try to roll up networks from the edges. For Jedburgh teams, every successful operation creates a new problem: how to keep the network alive long enough to matter again tomorrow. So the teams adapt. They move constantly. They rotate radio sites. They shorten transmissions. They rely on compartmentalization, so one compromise doesn't unravel an entire region. They lean on local knowledge, the back roads, the safe houses, the social terrain that outsiders can't read. The work becomes less like a sequence of missions and more like survival while maintaining output, continuous disruption without catastrophic exposure. As the Allies push deeper into France, Jedburgh's value also shifts toward consolidation. Resistance networks that were effective in harassment now had to transition, sometimes painfully, into a different role, supporting stabilization, guiding Allied units through local terrain, identifying remaining German pockets, and preventing chaos from filling the vacuum of liberation. That transition carried tension. Some fighters wanted to keep operating independently. Some expected immediate political recognition. Some had scores to settle. Jedburgh teams, while military in purpose, were forced to navigate these realities because operational success depended on local cohesion. A network that fractures at the moment of victory can still produce tragedy. Here's the uncomfortable truth: behind-the-lines warfare doesn't end cleanly when the front line moves. At the operational level, Jedburgh's turning point is the shift from isolated acts to synchronized pressure aligned with major Allied offensives. When sabotage and ambushes are timed to moments of maximum German movement, reinforcement pushes, withdrawals, regrouping, small actions gain strategic weight. A bridge destroyed at random is a headline. A bridge destroyed on the night a division needs it is a turning point. And that's the payoff Jedburgh sought: to force Germany to fight the campaign with broken timing. Even when a German unit wasn't destroyed, it could be delayed, rerouted, split, or forced into defensive postures it didn't want. Those effects accumulate. They reduce the defender's ability to create a concentrated counterstroke. They make the front less predictable for German planners and more predictable for Allied planners, because disruption narrows the enemy's options into fewer, worse choices. But don't miss the second twist. Jedburgh also created a template for modern special operations, and the lesson isn't "be daring." It's "be useful." Because the most lasting impact of Jedburgh isn't the romance of parachutes. It's the concept of small teams enabling larger forces by working through local partners, blending intelligence, logistics, and influence into one operational package. It's a reminder that modern warfare isn't only about the weapons you field, but the systems you build, systems that move information and supplies, shape decisions, and create momentum. In the aftermath, Jedburgh's legacy becomes clearer with distance. In the short term, the teams contributed to the acceleration of the campaign in France by complicating German movement and improving coordination with local resistance. In the long term, they offered a model of Allied cooperation, multinational teams, unified purpose, and a shared operational language across different services and cultures. And they proved something that feels counterintuitive. The most powerful action behind enemy lines is often not destruction, but connection. The act of linking local capability to strategic timing can change what an army is able to do at the front. final payoff, Jedburgh mattered because it attacked the enemy's ability to respond. It turned the resistance into an amplifier of Allied tempo, not by replacing local fighters, but by aligning them with the operational clock of an invasion. And in a campaign where days could decide whether a beachhead becomes a breakthrough or a stalemate, that alignment was a weapon. Jedburgh's key lesson is that the turning point wasn't a single blast. It was the decision to synchronize thousands of small actions into one shared timetable. If you had been writing that timetable, what would you prioritize? Rail lines, bridges, or communications? If this kind of behind-the-lines strategy is your thing, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and turn on bell notifications so you don't miss the next decision point we dissect. Comment prompt. Which part of the Jedburgh method mattered most? Radio coordination, restraint, or local trust? By the end of the daylight battle on February 27th, the Allied ABDA fleet has already taken punishing damage and lost cohesion. The convoy is still the objective, but the Japanese escort has turned the fight into a denial battle, blocking access rather than merely trading fire. Now night has fallen, and Doorman chooses to press on despite scattered ships, strained communications, and a sea that punishes navigation errors. The stakes are unchanged. Stop or delay the invasion of Java, or watch the Dutch East Indies fall and the strategic map of the Pacific tilt even further. The night phase is where doctrine becomes destiny. In daylight, surface battles can feel like a contest of gunnery and maneuver in open water. At night, the engagement becomes a test of preparation. How crews handle identification, how officers maintain formation discipline, how quickly weapons teams can act without perfect visibility. The Japanese escort forces had a specific advantage here, a practiced approach to launching torpedoes at long range under low visibility, then repositioning to strike again. This method doesn't require a dramatic close-in brawl. It requires patience, timing, and confidence that the enemy will continue moving along predictable paths. And the Allied fleet, in trying to reach the convoy, had to keep moving, had to take those paths. One by one, the situation tightens. A ship separated from the formation becomes vulnerable. A delayed turn puts a cruiser where a torpedo spread is expected to pass. A brief radio silence, intended to reduce detection or confusion, can instead prevent a warning from reaching the ships that need it most. Rehook. The twist is that the most lethal weapons in this battle don't need direct hits on the convoy. They only need to hit the escorts trying to reach it. Then the night delivers what the daylight only threatened, a sudden, violent reversal. Long-range torpedoes enter the fight not as a last resort, but as the centerpiece. They are launched into predicted lanes, into the spaces where an enemy must pass if it continues its mission. Unlike gunnery, a torpedo's danger isn't visible until it's too late, especially in darkness, when a wake is hard to spot and a warning may arrive seconds before impact. When the decisive hits occur, they don't just damage ships. They shatter command and clarity. A flagship in trouble doesn't only lose firepower, it loses the ability to coordinate an already fragile multinational force. A cruiser sinking in darkness pulls escorts away for rescue or collision avoidance, further scattering the formation. And because this is a fleet action with limited air cover and no safe nearby harbor, withdrawal doesn't mean safety. It means attempting escape through waters that the enemy can patrol, through straits and approaches that can become ambush points. In the immediate aftermath, the battle's meaning becomes brutally clear. The escort screen has held. The Allied force has been pushed back and broken. The convoy's route to Java is no longer contested by a coherent fleet. Rehook. The most important outcome isn't the sinking itself, it's the space created for the invasion to land on schedule. Within days, the story expands beyond one engagement and becomes a chain reaction. Java's defenders now face landings with fewer naval options to disrupt supply lines. Even a single surviving cruiser matters less when it cannot operate without air cover and when Japanese forces control nearby airfields. The Japanese can land troops, move supplies, and consolidate positions faster than the defenders can respond. And the sea isn't finished collecting ships. The retreating Allied survivors run into follow-on actions, confused night passages and encounters near choke points where the remaining Allied cruisers and destroyers try to break out. This is where the Battle of the Java Sea becomes more than a single date. It becomes the opening act of a rapid collapse of naval resistance in the region, the grim sequence of engagements that remove the last Allied surface threat near Java. From a strategic perspective, this matters for three reasons. First, resources. The Dutch East Indies oil and port infrastructure become available to Japan, at least in the near term, adding depth to its wartime logistics. Even damaged facilities can be repaired. The key is control. Second, routes and basing. With Java and surrounding approaches under Japanese control, Allied movement becomes constrained. Any counteroffensive now requires longer supply lines, new bases, and time to assemble a force capable of returning. Third, doctrine and adaptation. The Allies learn, painfully, that mixed fleets without unified communications, air cover, and shared procedures are at a severe disadvantage against a well-drilled opponent. The lesson isn't that coalition warfare is impossible, it's that coalition warfare requires systems built before the crisis, not during it. Rehook, here's the deeper lesson. This battle didn't end Allied resistance because the Allies lacked courage. It ended it because they lacked a unified way to fight at sea. Now comes the turning point in the larger story, the Allied shift in how they intend to fight the war across the Pacific. After the early 1942 disasters, Allied strategy increasingly moves toward strengths that don't require exposing vulnerable surface fleets in contested waters. Carriers, submarines, and land-based air power begin to define the next phase. Not because surface ships become irrelevant, but because surface ships operating without air superiority become liabilities. Submarines, in particular, offer a different kind of pressure. They can threaten supply lines without needing to defeat escorts in a set-piece surface engagement. They can stretch an enemy's defensive commitments across wide oceans. They can create uncertainty, an intangible but powerful strategic weapon. And carriers, when massed and protected, can provide the air cover that the ABDA fleets lacked. Air power changes everything. It expands reconnaissance, controls engagement range, and makes convoys vulnerable long before ships can reach gunnery distance. In that light, the Battle of the Java Sea becomes a signpost, the end of an era of desperate surface fleet interception without air cover, and the beginning of a more methodical, system-based approach to Pacific warfare. Rehook. The twist is that defeat can be instructive, if a navy survives long enough to apply the lesson. There's also a human dimension that matters for the documentary payoff. Coalition sailors fought in unfamiliar formations under leadership structures that were still forming. Crews had to trust signals they didn't always interpret the same way. They faced an enemy that had momentum, preparation, and initiative. In this environment, even competent decisions can look foolish in hindsight because the variables were stacked against them. But the mission wasn't irrational. The logic, delay the invasion by time, complicate Japan's timeline, was strategically sound. The tragedy is that the tools available were insufficient for the job as defined by the calendar. And that calendar was relentless. The Japanese advance in early 1942 had a rhythm: seize an airfield, extend coverage, strike the next objective, repeat. The Allies couldn't match that rhythm yet, not until industrial output, training pipelines, and operational coordination matured later in the war. So the final payoff is not just Java fell. It's what that fall forced next. It forced the Allies to accept that early 1942 would be about survival and delay, not immediate reversal. It forced a reevaluation of how surface fleets operate under air threat. It pushed coalition planning toward tighter integration, clearer command structures, and shared procedures. And it demonstrated that the Pacific War would not be won by a single heroic interception, but by building systems, reconnaissance, logistics, air cover, training, that could outlast an enemy's early momentum. Final payoff line. The Battle of the Java Sea didn't just open a route to Indonesia. It closed the door on a hurried, improvised defense, and pushed the Allies toward a new kind of war that would eventually roll back the perimeter, step by step. If you had been in Doorman's position, would you have pressed into the night anyway, or saved the fleet for a different kind of fight? If this story made you see the early Pacific War in a new light, hit like, share it with a friend who loves naval history, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next turning point. Comment below, which single decision mattered more here, pursuing the convoy after dark, or attempting to fight as a coalition before the system was ready. This is the key turning point stated plainly. Operation Hugo pushed beyond its logistics, while Allied air supply and reinforcement kept the defenders functioning until relief and counteroffensives broke the siege dynamic. From that moment, the question wasn't, can Japan win? It was, how many can Japan withdraw before the operation becomes a ruinous retreat? And that retreat became one of the campaign's defining human realities, without requiring graphic description. When an army runs out of food in jungle hills, fighting power doesn't decline in a straight line. It drops suddenly, men fall out, weapons are abandoned, medical systems disappear, and the distance back to safety feels longer every day. This is why many summaries of Hugo emphasize that losses were amplified by disease, starvation, and exhaustion once the offensive failed, because those conditions are exactly what an overextended force creates for itself when it tries to sustain a deep advance without secure supply. By late June into July 1944, the linked battles reached their conclusion. The National Army Museum's date range for the battles, March 8 to July 18, 1944, captures the full arc, from initial Japanese thrusts, through siege and relief, to the final breaking of the offensive. Now step back for the payoff, what changed and why it mattered. First, the campaign effect. Kohima, Impul removed the immediate Japanese threat to India's frontier and preserved the Allied base for launching the reconquest of Burma. That's why the battles are repeatedly framed as a turning point and a springboard for what followed. Second, the operational lesson. Air supply, used at scale, could keep surrounded forces alive long enough to reverse an encirclement narrative. The Burma theater became a proving ground for how air transport and logistics could change what surrounded actually meant. Third, the strategic warning embedded in Hugo. A plan that requires the enemy to provide your supplies is a plan that collapses the moment the enemy denies you that capture, or simply holds long enough that you can't carry what you need. In mountain jungle warfare, the logistics margin is so thin that optimism becomes fatal. One final rehook before the close. It's tempting to remember Kohima, Impul as a story of geography and endurance, and it is, but at its core it's a story about decision-making under constraints. Japan gambled on speed and captured stores. The Allies gambled on air supply and staying power. Both gambles carried risk. Only one aligned with what the terrain and the calendar would allow. Kohima, Impul was decided when one side chose to hold and feed an army by air while the other side's supply gamble quietly ran out of road. If that turning point surprised you, hit like and share this with someone who loves the how behind campaigns, then subscribe and turn on bell notifications for more deep dive World War II history. Comment prompt. Which mattered more here? Mutaguchi's decision to push Hugo forward, or the Allied decision to keep Impul alive by air?